The year was 1240, and death rode across the frozen steppes of Eastern Europe with the thunder of 10,000 hooves. The Mongol Empire, that vast machine of conquest that had already devoured China, crushed Persia, and turned countless kingdoms into ash, was carving its bloody path toward the heart of medieval Europe. No army had stopped them. No fortress had held against their siege engines. No strategy had broken their momentum. They were the storm that consumed civilizations, leaving only silence and smoke in their wake. But in the bitter cold of a forgotten mountain pass, mathematics was about to collide with madness. 100 men were preparing to face an empire. Not an army, an empire. The odds were so astronomical that calling it a battle seems almost insulting to the very concept of warfare. This was David facing Goliath. If David had brought 99 friends, and Goliath had brought the entire population of a major city. What happened in that narrow corridor of rock and ice would defy every principle of military science. It would challenge the very laws of probability. And it would create a legend so terrifying that the most feared warriors on earth would carry the memory of it like a curse for generations to come. This is the story of how the unstoppable force met the immovable object, and how both were forever changed by the collision. The Mongols weren't just conquerors. They were the architects of apocalypse. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, they had perfected warfare to a degree that seemed almost supernatural to their victims. Their composite bows could punch through armor at distances that made European crossbows look like children's toys. Their cavalry moved with a coordination that turned entire battlefields into killing floors. Their psychological warfare was so effective that cities would surrender at the mere rumor of their approach. By 1240, the Golden Horde under Batu Khan had already demonstrated their terrifying efficiency in the lands of the Rus. Moscow had fallen without meaningful resistance. Vladimir had been reduced to smoldering ruins. Kiev, the great jewel of Eastern Slavic civilization, had been transformed into a charnel house where the streets ran red with blood, and the towers that had stood for centuries were pulled down stone by stone. The Mongol war machine operated on principles that European military minds could barely comprehend. They didn't just defeat armies, they erased them. They didn't just capture cities, they deleted them from existence. Their intelligence networks were so sophisticated that they often knew more about a region's defenses than the defenders themselves. Their logistics were so advanced that they could sustain massive armies across thousands of miles of hostile territory. And their tactical flexibility was so complete that they could adapt to any battlefield condition with lethal efficiency. What made them truly terrifying wasn't just their military prowess. It was their systematic approach to conquest. They would offer terms to their enemies. Submit completely and your population might be spared. Resist, and every living thing within your borders would be exterminated. They didn't make idle threats. The bones of countless civilizations bore witness to their commitment to total warfare. The psychological impact of the Mongol advance was perhaps as devastating as their actual military campaigns. Word of their approach would race ahead of their armies like wildfire. Entire populations would flee their homes rather than face the choice between submission and annihilation. Trade routes that had connected civilizations for centuries would be abandoned. Religious centers that had stood since time immemorial would be evacuated by monks and priests who understood that their sacred walls offered no protection against the coming storm. But in the winter of 1240, as the Golden Horde pressed westward toward the heart of Europe, they encountered something unprecedented. Not an army arrayed in traditional formation, not a fortress built to withstand siege, not even a desperate last stand by local nobility trying to protect their lands. Instead, they found something that shouldn't have existed according to every rule of medieval warfare. In the narrow mountain pass known as Bigoda, a band of warriors had taken position. These weren't knights fighting for feudal obligations. They weren't peasant levies driven by desperation. They weren't even regular soldiers serving an established kingdom. They were something far more dangerous. They were men with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to run. The Varangian Guard had once been the elite of elites. These northern warriors had served Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, where their reputation for absolute loyalty and devastating combat effectiveness had made them legendary. They had fought in the deserts of Syria, the mountains of Armenia, and the plains of Bulgaria. They had faced Arab cavalry, Bulgarian infantry, and Norman heavy horse. They had survived battles that had broken veteran legions and emerged with their reputations not just intact, but enhanced. But the world was changing. Constantinople was no longer the power it had once been. The great trade routes that had sustained the Byzantine economy were shifting. The political landscape that had made the Varangian Guard necessary was evolving beyond recognition. These warriors found themselves in a world that no longer had a place for their particular brand of warfare. Some had drifted north, seeking employment with the princes of the Rus. Others had turned to mercenary work, selling their skills to whatever lord could afford their services. A few had attempted to return to their northern homelands, only to find that decades of service in foreign lands had made them strangers in their own countries. They were men caught between worlds, belonging fully to none. When the Mongol storm broke over Eastern Europe, these displaced warriors found themselves facing the same choice as everyone else. Flee westward, ahead of the advancing horde, submit to Mongol rule, or stand and fight against impossible odds. But for men who had spent their lives defining themselves through combat, who had built their identities around their ability to face any enemy and emerge victorious, surrender wasn't really an option. At their head stood a man who embodied everything that made the Varangian Guard legendary. Bjorn the Unbreakable was a giant even by northern standards, standing nearly 7 feet tall and built like a fortress made flesh. His reputation had been forged in 100 battles across 2 continents. He had faced Arab heavy cavalry in the Syrian desert and emerged victorious. He had stood against Bulgarian infantry in mountain passes and held the line when lesser men would have broken. He had commanded the respect of Byzantine generals and the fear of their enemies. But more than his physical presence or his combat record, what made Bjorn truly dangerous was his understanding of warfare itself. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a tactician who could read terrain like a scholar reads manuscripts. He could assess the strengths and weaknesses of enemy forces with a glance. And most importantly, he could inspire absolute confidence in men who followed him into situations that rational analysis would deem hopeless. When Bjorn looked at the Pagoda Pass, he didn't see a place to make a last stand. He saw a tactical opportunity that could transform mathematical impossibility into strategic advantage. The pass was narrow, barely 50 meters wide at its narrowest point. The ground was treacherous, covered in ice and loose stone that would challenge the footing of man and horse alike. The walls on either side rose steeply, creating natural barriers that would funnel any attacking force into a killing ground. Most importantly, Bjorn understood something that the Mongols had perhaps forgotten in their string of easy victories. Numbers only matter if you can bring them to bear effectively. In the open field, 10,000 Mongol cavalry could surround and destroy 100 infantry in minutes. But in a narrow pass, only the front rank could engage at any given moment. The mathematical advantage that made the Mongols unstoppable on the steppe became meaningless in a confined space. The men who gathered around Bjorn in that frozen pass understood what they were choosing. They weren't fighting for treasure or territory. They weren't motivated by feudal obligations or religious fervor. They were fighting because it was what they were, not what they did. For warriors who had defined themselves through combat, who had built their entire identities around their ability to face impossible odds and emerge victorious, this was their moment of ultimate definition. As word spread of the Mongol approach, these scattered remnants of the Varangian Guard made their way to the Pagoda Pass. They came from across the lands of the Rus, abandoning whatever temporary employment or shelter they had found. They came knowing that they were marching towards certain death. But they also came knowing that they would die as what they had always been: warriors. The preparations were methodical and professional. These weren't desperate men making futile gestures. They were veteran soldiers preparing for what they knew would be the most important battle of their lives. They studied the terrain with the careful attention of men who understood that every stone and shadow could mean the difference between victory and disaster. They positioned themselves with the precision of craftsmen arranging their tools. When the Mongol scouts first spotted the small force blocking the pass, they must have assumed it was some kind of mistake. 100 men attempting to block the path of the most successful military force in human history seemed like a joke rather than a military tactic. The scout reports that made their way back to the main Mongol force probably described the situation as a minor inconvenience that could be cleared away with minimal effort. But as the first elements of the Mongol vanguard approached the pass, they began to understand that they weren't dealing with a desperate rabble or a symbolic gesture. The men arrayed against them moved with the precision of elite troops. Their equipment was professional and well maintained. Their formation was textbook perfect. Most disturbing of all, they showed no signs of the fear that had preceded every other Mongol victory. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything both sides understood about warfare. The irresistible force was about to meet the immovable object, and the collision would create shockwaves that would be felt across continents. The Mongol vanguard commander, who first laid eyes on the Varangian formation, probably felt a moment of genuine confusion. In their decades of conquest, they had developed an almost supernatural ability to read battlefields. They could assess enemy strength, morale, and tactical capability within moments of visual contact. They had seen every conceivable form of resistance, from the desperate charges of doomed cavalry to the pathetic huddles of terrified infantry. But this was something different. The men blocking the pass weren't displaying the telltale signs of impending collapse that had preceded every other Mongol victory. There was no nervous shuffling in the ranks, no officers frantically shouting orders to maintain discipline, no visible preparation for retreat. Instead, there was an almost supernatural stillness, the kind of calm that precedes either complete annihilation or something far more dangerous. What the Mongol commander was witnessing was the product of decades of the most brutal military training imaginable. The Varangian Guard had been forged in the crucible of Byzantine warfare, where survival meant mastering not just individual combat skills, but the kind of unit cohesion that could withstand psychological pressure that would break ordinary troops. These men had stood in formation while Arab cavalry thundered toward them across desert sands. They had held their ground while enemy arrows darkened the sky above Constantinople's walls. They had maintained discipline while siege engines hurled death at their positions. But more than their training, what made these warriors truly dangerous was their acceptance of their fate. Fear is the great destroyer of military formations. It's the invisible enemy that can shatter the most carefully planned defensive position in seconds. But fear requires hope, and hope requires the possibility of survival. The men in Bigoda Pass had moved beyond such considerations. They had chosen their deaths, and in that choice, they had found a terrible kind of freedom. The first Mongol probe came as expected. A small force of light cavalry, perhaps 50 riders, approached the pass at speed. This was standard Mongol tactics. Test the enemy response, assess their capabilities, look for signs of weakness or panic that could be exploited in the main assault. The riders expected to see the defensive formation waver, to witness the first cracks in enemy morale that would make the subsequent massacre swift and efficient. Instead, they encountered something that violated every principle of psychological warfare they had ever learned. The Varangian line didn't move. Not a single warrior shifted position or adjusted his grip on his weapon. The great shields remained locked together in an unbroken wall of iron and oak. Most unsettling of all, there were no shouts of defiance or desperate battle cries. The defenders simply waited with the patience of men who had already made peace with eternity. The Mongol riders wheeled and charged, loosing arrows as they came. Their composite bows, capable of punching through mail at 200 paces, sent a cloud of death toward the motionless formation. The sound was like hail on a metal roof, the sharp impacts of steel points finding their marks on shield and armor. When the arrow storm passed, the Mongol cavalry expected to see gaps in the line, wounded men crying out, the beginning of the psychological collapse that always preceded their victories. But when the dust settled, the wall remained intact. The great shields of the Varangians, reinforced with iron bands and backed by men who had faced such storms before, had absorbed the impact without yielding. Where arrows had found their marks, they protruded like deadly quills, but the men behind the shields stood unmoved. It was their first glimpse of what they were truly facing. The psychological impact on the Mongol riders was immediate and profound. These were veterans who had broken countless enemy formations with their opening volleys. They had seen entire armies scatter at the first taste of Mongol archery. But here, their most reliable tactic had produced no visible effect. Worse, the complete lack of response from their targets suggested a level of discipline and determination that challenged their fundamental understanding of human nature in combat. As the light cavalry withdrew to report their findings, the main Mongol force was already deploying for what should have been a routine engagement. The vanguard commander had no reason to expect anything other than a swift victory. 100 infantry, no matter how well trained, simply could not withstand the coordinated assault of thousands of the world's finest cavalry. The mathematics of warfare made any other outcome impossible, but mathematics, as Bjorn understood, could be a flexible science when applied with sufficient creativity and an absolute willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. The narrow confines of the pass would force the Mongols to attack in waves, rather than the overwhelming mass assault that had crushed every other opponent. The treacherous footing would rob their cavalry of the speed and maneuverability that made them unstoppable on open ground. Most importantly, the terrain would negate the Mongol advantage in numbers by creating a series of individual combats rather than a general melee. The first major assault came with the thunder of 1,000 hooves striking frozen ground. The Mongol heavy cavalry, the elite shock troops who had smashed through the gates of a dozen capitals, charged toward the Varangian position with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. Their war cries echoed off the canyon walls, a sound designed to shatter enemy morale before the first blade was drawn. But as the distance closed, the fundamental problem with cavalry charges in confined spaces became apparent. The riders in the front rank found themselves compressed together, unable to maneuver, forced to approach the enemy line in a narrow column rather than the devastating wide front that made cavalry charges irresistible. Behind them, hundreds more warriors pushed forward, creating a mass of horseflesh and steel that had nowhere to go but straight into the waiting weapons of their enemies. The collision, when it came, was unlike anything in the annals of medieval warfare. The Mongol horses, trained for war but still governed by animal instinct, balked at charging directly into an unbroken wall of steel points. Their momentum faltered just as they reached the Varangian line, creating a moment of chaos as riders tried to control their mounts while maintaining their attack formation. In that moment of confusion, Bjorn gave the single order that would transform defensive action into offensive slaughter. The shield wall didn't retreat or hold its position. Instead, it exploded outward like a trap springing shut. The great Danish axes, two-handed weapons capable of cleaving through armor and bone with equal ease, descended in a coordinated strike that turned the front rank of Mongol cavalry into a red mist of blood and shattered steel. The killing ground that Bjorn had created was a masterpiece of tactical engineering. The narrow space prevented the Mongols from using their numbers effectively, while forcing them to fight exactly the kind of close-quarters battle where northern warriors excelled. The treacherous footing that had been a challenge for defenders became a death trap for attackers trying to maintain their balance while avoiding the sweeping arcs of battle axes. But perhaps most devastating was the psychological impact of watching their elite cavalry, the troops who had never failed in a charge, simply disappear into a meat grinder of northern steel. The riders in the second and third ranks found themselves pushing forward into a space that had become a slaughterhouse, forced by the pressure of those behind them to advance into certain death. The carnage was systematic and professional. These weren't berserkers fighting in mindless fury. They were craftsmen practicing their deadly trade with the precision that comes from decades of experience. Each stroke of an axe was calculated for maximum effect. Each movement was coordinated with the warriors on either side. The result was an industrial-scale destruction that reduced the pride of the Mongol military to scattered fragments in a matter of minutes. As the survivors of the first assault pulled back in confusion and growing panic, they left behind a scene that challenged everything they thought they understood about warfare. The narrow entrance to the pass was choked with the bodies of men and horses, creating a barrier that would make subsequent attacks even more difficult. Blood had turned the icy ground into a treacherous surface that would challenge the footing of any force attempting to advance. Most disturbing of all, the 100 warriors who had accomplished this impossible feat showed no signs of fatigue or diminished capability. The Mongol vanguard commander found himself facing a tactical situation that existed nowhere in their extensive military manuals. His elite troops, the cavalry that had broken every enemy formation they had ever faced, had been not just defeated, but annihilated by an enemy force a tenth their size. The psychological foundations of Mongol military superiority were beginning to crack under the weight of an impossibility made manifest. As night fell over the blood-soaked pass, both sides prepared for what would come next. The Mongols, for the first time in their campaign of conquest, found themselves forced to reconsider their approach. The Varangians, having survived the first test, understood that they had only proven it was possible to make the impossible bleed. The real war was just beginning. The darkness that settled over Pagoda Pass carried with it a silence more terrifying than any battle cry. In the Mongol camp, scattered across the valley floor, like a constellation of malevolent stars, 10,000 warriors sat around their fires and tried to process what they had witnessed. These were men who had seen the walls of Kiev crumble beneath their siege engines. They had watched the flower of Russian nobility cut down like wheat before their arrows. They had reduced entire civilizations to ash and memory, but they had never seen their own elite cavalry simply vanish into a narrow corridor of rock and ice. The psychology of conquest depends entirely on inevitability. The Mongol war machine had functioned with such devastating efficiency precisely because their enemies understood that resistance was futile. Cities surrendered at the first sight of their banners because everyone knew that fighting only delayed the inevitable while ensuring complete destruction. But inevitability, once cracked, becomes something far more fragile than it appears. Around those campfires, seasoned warriors who had ridden from the steppes of Mongolia to the gates of Vienna began to whisper questions that had never occurred to them before. If 100 men could stop their vanguard, what did that say about their legendary invincibility? If their finest cavalry could be slaughtered by northern infantry in a mountain pass, what other tactical assumptions might prove fatally flawed? The very foundation of their psychological warfare was beginning to erode. In the pass itself, Bjorn moved among his surviving warriors with the methodical attention of a craftsman inspecting his tools. 43 men had paid the price for their impossible victory. Their bodies lay scattered among the Mongol dead, testimony to the cost of turning mathematical impossibility into tactical reality. But 57 remained, and each of those men had proven something that defied every principle of military science. The wounded were tended with the efficient brutality of field medicine. Broken bones were splintered with strips torn from enemy armor. Gaping wounds were cauterized with heated blade tips. Men who could no longer fight effectively were given tasks that would keep them useful until the end came. There were no complaints, no requests for mercy, no suggestions of retreat. These warriors had moved beyond such considerations when they chose to make their stand. Bjorn understood better than anyone that their victory, miraculous as it seemed, had only delayed the inevitable. The Mongol force arrayed against them was barely a fraction of the total army advancing across Eastern Europe. Even if they managed to destroy the entire vanguard, which seemed impossible given their losses, it would merely force the main body to take a longer route to their ultimate destination. But delay, in the mathematics of medieval warfare, could sometimes be more valuable than victory. Every day the Golden Horde spent dealing with the Varangian resistance was a day that European kingdoms could use to prepare their defences. Every casualty inflicted in this frozen pass was one less warrior available for the sieges of Vienna or Paris. Every moment of doubt planted in Mongol minds was a crack in the armour of psychological superiority that had made their conquest possible. The 100 men in Pagoda Pass weren't just fighting for their own honour, they were fighting for time itself. As the hours of darkness crawled past, the sound of construction began to echo from the Mongol camp. The survivors of the first assault had reported that conventional cavalry charges were useless in the confined space of the pass. If the mountain warriors could not be broken by speed and shock, they would be crushed by methodical engineering. The Mongols began assembling siege equipment specifically designed to deal with infantry formations in narrow spaces. The first machines to appear were the torsion engines captured from Chinese workshops during the conquest of the Jin dynasty. These weren't the massive trebuchets used to breach city walls, but smaller, more precise weapons designed to deliver concentrated destruction to specific targets. Their operators had learned their craft in the sieges of Beijing and Kaifeng, where precision mattered more than raw power. Now they would apply that expertise to the problem of eliminating 100 stubborn northerners. But siege engines were only part of the solution. The Mongol commanders had also summoned their heavy infantry, the professional foot soldiers recruited from conquered territories and trained in the specialized techniques of assault warfare. These weren't the swift cavalry that formed the backbone of steppe armies, but methodical killers who understood how to break defensive formations through sustained pressure and tactical coordination. Most ominous of all were the specialists being brought forward from the army's rear echelons. Combat engineers who had learned their trade in the siege tunnels beneath fortress walls. Alchemists who understood the military applications of Greek fire and other incendiary compounds. Veterans of urban warfare who had mastered the brutal techniques of street fighting and building clearance. The Mongols were preparing to apply the full spectrum of their military expertise to the elimination of the Varangian threat. When dawn broke over the mountain pass, it illuminated a scene that looked more like a siege than a traditional battlefield. The narrow entrance to the pass had been transformed into a killing ground where conventional tactics meant nothing and survival depended entirely on will and craftsmanship. The bodies from the previous day's fighting had frozen solid in the bitter cold, creating a macabre barrier that would complicate any assault. Bjorn surveyed the approaching Mongol preparations with the calm assessment of a professional soldier. The siege engines were positioned at maximum range, their crews protected by improvised barriers constructed from captured shields and salvaged armor. The heavy infantry was forming up in assault columns, their equipment modified for the specific challenges of fighting in confined spaces. Most telling of all, the Mongol cavalry had withdrawn to supporting positions. Tacit acknowledgement that their primary weapon was useless in this particular theatre of war. The first bombardment came without warning, a sudden storm of projectiles that turned the morning air into a chaos of whistling death. But these weren't the massive stone balls used against fortress walls. Instead, the Mongol engines hurled smaller, more specialized ammunition designed to maximize casualties among infantry formations. Clay pots filled with burning oil created pools of fire that clung to armor and flesh with terrifying persistence. Iron caltrops scattered across the defensive positions to cripple anyone who moved incautiously. Most devastating of all were the flechette rounds, containers that burst in mid-air to shower the Varangian positions with hundreds of razor-sharp iron darts. The defensive formation that had proven so effective against cavalry charges became a liability under sustained bombardment. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the shield wall were forced to scatter for whatever cover the rocky terrain could provide. The careful coordination that had made their impossible victory possible began to break down under the systematic destruction raining from the sky. But Bjorn had anticipated this development. The terrain that made cavalry charges impossible also provided numerous defensive positions for infantry under fire. Rocky outcroppings became improvised bunkers. Crevices in the canyon walls offered protection from overhead bombardment. Most importantly, the narrow confines of the pass limited the effectiveness of area weapons, creating dead spaces where determined defenders could survive even concentrated fire. The bombardment continued for what felt like hours, transforming the pass into a hellscape of smoke and scattered rubble. When it finally ceased, the silence that followed was pregnant with anticipation. Through the drifting smoke came the sound that every defender had been dreading, the rhythmic tramp of hundreds of boots moving in perfect synchronization. The Mongol heavy infantry was advancing to finish what the siege engines had begun. These weren't the swift horsemen who had dominated battlefields from China to Hungary. They were professional killers who understood how to break defensive positions through methodical application of overwhelming force. Their shields were reinforced with iron bands capable of turning aside the heaviest blows. Their weapons were specifically designed for close-quarters combat in confined spaces. Most importantly, their training had prepared them for exactly this kind of grinding, attritional warfare. The advancing infantry moved with the mechanical precision of a siege engine made flesh. Each rank maintained perfect spacing and alignment. Officers coordinated the advance with hand signals that eliminated the need for vocal commands. Most ominously, they showed none of the hesitation or uncertainty that had affected the cavalry units. These were soldiers who had learned their trade in the brutal school of urban warfare, where survival meant mastering the techniques of systematic violence. As the distance closed between the advancing Mongols and the scattered Varangian positions, individual acts of heroism began to emerge from the chaos of systematic destruction. Warriors who had lost their primary weapons improvised with whatever came to hand. Men too wounded to fight effectively became human shields for their more capable comrades. The disciplined formation fighting that had characterized the previous day's battle gave way to a series of desperate individual combats scattered across the length of the pass. But even in this apparent chaos, the professional expertise that had made the Varangian Guard legendary began to assert itself. These were men who had learned to fight not just as part of coordinated formations, but as individual warriors capable of holding their own against multiple opponents. Years of service in the Byzantine Empire had taught them to adapt to rapidly changing tactical situations, to maintain effectiveness even when separated from their units and fighting alone. The narrow confines of the pass that had neutralized Mongol cavalry now began to work against the advancing infantry as well. The rocky terrain that provided cover for defenders also created obstacles for attackers trying to maintain formation integrity. Dead ground that protected scattered Varangians from siege engine fire also concealed them from approaching enemies until the last possible moment. The mountain pass was becoming a maze of individual battlefields where numerical superiority meant nothing, and survival depended entirely on individual skill and determination. In this environment, the fundamental differences between Mongol and Varangian military culture became starkly apparent. The Mongol soldiers were superbly trained and equipped professionals, but their strength lay in coordination and systematic application of proven tactics. When those tactics failed or became impossible to implement, they found themselves fighting at a severe disadvantage. The Varangians, by contrast, had been trained from childhood to function as individual warriors first and formation fighters second. When their own tactical systems broke down, they simply reverted to the kind of individual combat that had been their original specialty. The result was a series of small-scale massacres scattered throughout the pass, each one a testament to the deadly effectiveness of northern warriors fighting on terrain that suited their individual capabilities. Mongol soldiers who had learned to depend on mutual support found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Professional fighters who had mastered the techniques of coordinated assault discovered that their training had not prepared them for the kind of personal combat that the mountain warriors had been practicing since childhood. As the morning wore on and the casualties mounted on both sides, it became clear that the Mongol assault was stalling despite their overwhelming numerical advantage. The systematic approach that had proven so effective in conventional warfare was being ground down by the simple reality that some opponents refused to be systematic in their resistance. Every yard gained cost more than it was worth. Every position captured was immediately contested by defenders who seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The Mongol commanders watching from their positions in the valley began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their military experience. Their professional soldiers, veterans of a dozen campaigns and masters of every conventional military technique, were being systematically destroyed by an enemy force that should have been eliminated hours ago. The mathematical certainty that had governed every previous Mongol victory was being challenged by warriors who seemed to operate according to different mathematical principles entirely. By midday, the sound of combat in the pass had taken on a different character entirely. The clash of formation fighting had given way to the more intimate sounds of individual combat. Steel rang against steel with the irregular rhythm of personal duels rather than the coordinated percussion of mass warfare. Voices called out in a dozen different languages as warriors from across the known world settled accounts that transcended nationality or politics. This was no longer about conquest or resistance. It had become something far more primal and personal. The transformation of organized warfare into individual combat marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the engagement. The Mongols had come to Pagoda Pass expecting to solve a tactical problem through the application of superior force and proven methodology. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a killing ground where their advantages meant nothing, and their enemies seemed to grow more dangerous as the odds against them increased. The stage was set for something that neither side had anticipated. Not a battle in any conventional sense, but a test of will so fundamental that it would determine not just who controlled a mountain pass, but which approach to warfare would prove superior when pushed to its absolute limits. What emerged from that chaos was something that defied every principle of medieval military doctrine. The systematic destruction that the Mongols had engineered was being answered by a form of warfare so primitive and yet so effective that it challenged the very foundations of their tactical understanding. Individual Varangians, cut off from their comrades and surrounded by enemies, were not surrendering or seeking quarter. Instead, they were transforming into something that resembled forces of nature more than human soldiers. The narrow confines that had been designed to trap the defenders were becoming death traps for the attackers. Every rock formation became a fortress. Every crevice in the canyon walls became a position from which a single warrior could hold off multiple opponents. The Mongol heavy infantry, trained to fight in coordinated units, found themselves being picked apart by enemies who seemed to materialize from the very stone itself. What the Mongol commanders were witnessing violated every assumption they had made about human behavior under extreme stress. Professional soldiers, when isolated and outnumbered, were supposed to break. They were supposed to surrender, flee, or at minimum lose effectiveness as their situation became hopeless. But these northern warriors seemed to become more dangerous as their circumstances grew more desperate. It was as if desperation itself was feeding their combat effectiveness rather than diminishing it. The reports filtering back to the Mongol command structure painted a picture that seemed impossible. Individual Varangians were holding positions against odds of 10 to 1. Warriors who should have been exhausted after hours of continuous combat were moving with the fluid grace of men fresh to the battlefield. Most disturbing of all, they were fighting with a joy that bordered on the supernatural, as if the proximity of death was intoxicating rather than terrifying. By early afternoon, the Mongol assault had devolved into something that resembled urban warfare more than traditional battlefield engagement. Small units of infantry were advancing from position to position, clearing each defensive point through methodical application of superior numbers. But the cost was becoming astronomical. Every rocky outcropping required a separate assault. Every defensive position demanded its own tactical solution. The mathematics of attrition were working against the attackers, despite their overwhelming numerical advantage. The psychological toll on the Mongol forces was becoming as significant as their physical casualties. These were veterans who had participated in the systematic destruction of the most powerful military forces in the known world. They had watched Chinese armies melt away before their charges. They had seen Russian princes kneel in submission rather than face the consequences of resistance. But they had never encountered enemies who seemed to welcome destruction as eagerly as they welcomed victory. In the end, Bjorn the Unbreakable and his 100 Varangians achieved something that no army, no fortress, and no strategy had managed before. They forced the unstoppable Mongol war machine to pause, to bleed, and to question its own invincibility. Though they fell in that frozen pass, their sacrifice bought Europe precious time and planted seeds of doubt in minds that had known only victory. The Golden Horde would continue westward, but they would never again march with the absolute certainty that had carried them from the steppes of Mongolia to the gates of Kiev. Sometimes, the greatest victories are measured not in territory gained, but in legends forged and empires reminded of their mortality.